Hi, everyone. It's Paul Laverne at Turning Point Counseling. I'm a registered psychotherapist, and I'm back today with Andrea Heinz. Hi, Andrea. How are you?
Hi, Paul. I'm great. Thank you so much for having me back.
Yeah, I'm really glad that we're able to meet again. Andrea and I did an interview last year, and for those that haven't watched it, I encourage you to go back on my channel and watch that first interview with Andrea, where she talked about her experience of being in the sex industry for 7 years. She worked in a brothel, she worked as a dominatrix, and also as a travel companion. So I wanted to touch base with Andrea again and follow up with her, focusing more this time on what her life has been like since leaving the sex industry, the impacts that being in the industry had on her, and the challenges she's faced, and how she's overcome that, and what she has to say about pro sex work ideology, or people that promote this as some empowering opportunity for young women to get into, because Andrea can speak to that, I believe, like no one else can, having directly lived that experience. So let's get going, Andrea. So my first question is, can you talk a little bit? Oh, and before we get going, you have been out of the industry 10 years. And so that seems to me like enough time to really get a sense of perspective. Probably different than 1 year out or 2 years out, or maybe even three. Now it's 10 years out. Your life has changed a lot. You're married with children. We can go into that as well. But my first question is, what was it like transitioning from a lifestyle of being in the sex industry for 7 years and going back to, sort of a normal life, finding a job and being married and raising a family? Can you talk about that a bit?
I think the best way to frame it is to say a roller coaster ride. It's
Mm,
really the most truthful descriptor of it, I think.
mhm,
And the reason why I say that is because I think a lot of people believe that when you leave traumatic environments and situations, that as soon as you're removed from those places, that suddenly you are just back to your old self, or healed, so to speak. And I don't think people understand that for most of us, and I think for everyone that I have met personally, exiting and that process of exiting and recovery, so to speak, is much more grueling sometimes than our active time in the commercial sex trade.
mhm.
And the reason for that is because of all the factors that we employ to survive that environment. So a lot of the self-justification and the rationalization and the dissociation and compartmentalization, and you could keep going, but you're in really almost like a state of survival, mental survival, if not your physical survival in that environment. So coming out of it, it's really a shock. It's really just like flipping the coin, and you are living really a completely different life.
Yeah, so I'd like to just elaborate a bit on what you just said. So it sounds like you're describing working in the industry as a perpetual state of chronic endangerment, and you literally need to develop specific coping skills and strategies to survive. And that, I find that word interesting, to survive. It implies that it's all you can do to get through the day, and that you're chronically sensing that your safety, physical, mental, or emotional, is at risk. So can you just kind of come back to that and just describe a little bit about how you did survive, and mention some of those things about justifying things, and the stories that you told yourself?
Yeah, like when people think of the commercial sex trade, as you know, and you've definitely seen, everyone has seen, there's these really polarized depictions of it, where it's either this really happy, glamorous lifestyle, lots of money, and just everything is just amazing. And then this other narrative where everything is tragic. It is abuse, physical abuse, sexual assaults. It's extreme, ends of the polarized
Mhm.
depictions of everything. But um, it, um, I think people think, well, if you are not in this position of being physically at risk, then you are okay, that you don't still need to in some way enact these survival methods. And for me personally, having been really a woman of quite privilege in the commercial sex industry, there weren't as many instances in my experience where I feared for my physical safety
Mm,
as compared to obviously a trafficking victim or a woman with less autonomy than that which I operated with. But now looking back, now that I'm in a much more healed space, and like you said, 10 years out this year, I can look back and think of hundreds of times where my mental health was at risk, my spiritual health was at risk, my emotional, health was at risk, and how many times and how many ways and how creative I got to protect myself from utter collapse in that. So I really struggle with that narrative of people kind of saying, well, you made lots of money, you set your own hours, you did your own thing, it was fine. Nobody was, stabbing you. Nobody was, physically hurting you to that degree that we hear of. But they really don't understand what it's like to go into a room hour after hour with strange man after strange man and have to take off your clothes for him and have him physically invade your body and enter your body and occupy it. And I don't think people, and that just speaks to the higher level of problems that we have in society, where people don't understand sexual abuse and what it does to a person internally in their psyche and in their emotional state.
yeah.
So, I told myself all the lies that everybody told themselves, and still that a lot of women continue to tell themselves to survive that, which is, this is my choice, I'm happy here, I'm exploiting them. If anything, I
Mm,
make I make good money, I'm paying my
mhm,
bills. Like, why would I go make $30 an hour when I make 300 an hour? There were
right.
so many things that I drawed from to, like you said, just mentally survive that. And I think more attention needs to be paid to that for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I like what you said about, people seem to think like, well, as long as you're not being, slapped around and physically beaten, like you're not being abused. But, I know from, just our last conversation and other survivors I've talked to, there's this awareness, I think that um, grows on you fairly quickly being in this, in the sex industry, that I'm really not cared for. My comfort and safety are of no consequence, are of value to the clients, if you want to call them that. They are emotionally detached, and I feel like I'm being literally used like an object, right? And I mean, tell me if I'm wrong, but this seems to be the common experience. So that seems to require a set of coping skills as well, to literally deal with that every single day. And I'm wondering, did you just sort of zone out or check out or dissociate, or, how did you deal with that? And am I right in that that was one of the more mentally challenging parts of this?
Yeah, no, that's totally all accurate. And I think for me, like, when I entered the sex industry, I wasn't fully disillusioned as to what I was going into, because again, I
Mhm.
had seen those two media depictions and I knew it was either going to go really good for me or really bad for me, because that was the two ends of it. It's either going to be glorious or tragic. And
Right.
when I started in there, my first few experiences being new were very traumatic, because people knew I was the new girl, and these men pushed their themselves on me, pushed my boundaries, pushed my limits. Um, they wanted value for money, as they call it.
Mhm.
And so early on, when you don't have that sense of self, which most of us don't as we're entering that, and you're often young, it's very easy to kind of get caught up in everything. And so here I am, 22 years old, really with not a lot of critical analysis skills, no worldly knowledge. And I'm now in this situation that's a pretty severe, serious situation that I wasn't equipped for. So when you find yourself in that, it's then the next thing, which makes sense, is to go into protective mode of yourself. And when you can't handle, being present and giving yourself like you would in all your other relationships prior to that, you learn very quickly, this isn't like every other romantic encounter I've had or sexual engagement. This is something, like you said, where I'm a nothing. I'm just a masturbatory aid. I'm not a human. And I think once you come to that realization, you can't sit in that feeling because it will destroy you. You will just feel like nothing. So
Yeah.
that's when then you start employing all those ways of self justifying what you're doing. And so for me, it was very quick that I slipped into that sex work ideology, because that was what was going to protect me mentally when I knew I had no other option but to be there.
Mhm. Yeah. Was there an idea or expectation when you went into it that, hey, most of the clients are probably nice guys and will be nice and treat me nice? Or did you not really think about that?
That's what I assumed would happen, because again, going back to those two depictions, I was entering into what I now know at the time was Edmonton's top brothel.
Mm,
And so it was very glamorous in its presentation,
mm,
and made me feel like that was the sex work world, and that I wasn't going to some seedy, you know, um, place where it's just going to be these seedy guys coming. I was at the top studio, so I was seeing doctors and lawyers
mm,
and professionals, and you assume that they are all good, kind-hearted people because they've been successful in their life. But a lot of times it was really the opposite. I found that the men with less money, the men that didn't have the prestigious titles, they were often the men that were much more kind to me in my personhood. Like they
mm,
didn't view me so much as a disposable commodity.
mhm,
Those men actually viewed me more human than the men who are used to having so much money and just throwing it around to get what they want at any
mhm.
time from anyone.
Yeah, and do you think respect can exist at all in that space? Because I hear men sometimes, or clients of mine. I work with a lot of men with compulsive sexual behaviors, and I'll hear them say, "Well, I was one of the nice Johns or the good ones, or I treated her nice. I was nice to her. I gave her a big tip," as though they're respecting that transaction. And I'm wondering, is it even possible for respect to exist in a transactional interaction where essentially one person is taking from the other, and you mime the actions. uh, I mean, I'm just thinking of this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you're miming the actions of giving, but inside are not, or are unable to. So can respect even exist in that? And like, oh, or another way to say this, did you ever feel respected by a client?
I think for me, my observation, my belief on it is that it's pseudo respect. It's
Mm,
a guise, like a cover, to make basically sex buyers feel absolved of the harm that they do, and absolved of the harm that's happening to them as well, too, right? It's, if I treat her well, then she'll treat me well. It's a mutually respectful encounter. And yes, it's respectful behavior to some degree. Like if the woman says, no, I don't want to do that, a lot of men would not continue to do that and would respect my boundaries. But when you take that zoom out approach and you actually look at the act of buying sexual access, there's no genuine consent once you introduce some form of coercion. And in this case, it's money. So as much as people want to say, I'm the nice guy, I respect her, this and that, well, you still commodified her, you still
yeah.
objectified her, you still exploited her marginalization, whether
Mm,
socially or economically. So you can tell yourself it's respectful and you can act in a seemingly respectful manner, but the very nature of what brought you to the door of that brothel was not respect for women as a whole, or you wouldn't be there at all.
yeah, and I'm wondering, how fast would that respect evaporate if she didn't give you what you wanted,
Hmm. Yeah,
right?
because
Or if
there
you
is that
respect her
innate,
that much, why don't you just hand her the money and there's no sex?
yeah, because there's that innate expectation, I should say, that comes
Expectation.
with that.
Yeah. Um, so, okay, what did you notice? And you can answer this, if you want, like 1 year out, 5 years out, 10 years out today. What did you notice different about you after leaving than before?
I've become much more honest with myself and much
Oh,
more
not what I
introspective.
expected you to say, but please say more about that.
Yeah, I think I've said it many times, what coming out of the sex industry feels like is like stepping out of a fog. It's a slow transition of awakening. And
Oh,
really, the last 2 years that I was in the sex industry was the beginning of that fog starting to lift.
oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, yeah. And it took a full 2 years before I was able, within my life, to know that I could leave the industry and not have to return back to it, which was really important for me. I didn't want to be part of that revolving door system because I knew that that would further push down my self-esteem and would make it probably even harder for me to find that strength and that resilience to just walk away and feel okay about myself and like I hadn't failed. But yeah, even after I exited, there was still parts of me that were still adhering to like harm reduction in the sex trade and thinking, well, there's still moments where it can be consensual. There's still some people where this is an actual true choice for them. And it took a lot of really reading and just exposure to other narratives and conversations and podcasts of people like yourself, like exposing the actual truth when money isn't a factor, where
Mm.
women can actually be honest about what that experience was like, and they don't have to lie about it anymore. And it that's not a narrative that's out there a lot. It's one that you really have to go looking for.
Did,
So
was there
it,
any other, survivor books or speakers that you heard that helped kind of lift the last of that fog away to be like, yeah, you know what, this is what the truth is really, this is what's really happening?
Yeah, probably most profound for me was a woman out of the UK by the name of Rebecca Mott.
Yes, I've heard of
Um,
her, Rebecca.
yeah, yeah, she's really a brilliant woman who just
Mm,
has, power in her pen. She just has this way
yeah.
of really channeling what she lived, many years ago and still
Mm,
making it seem so fresh and raw. And I
yeah.
remember when I was kind of, in that turning point or tipping point, so to speak, I would go home after my shifts at the brothel and I would go right to her website because at the time she had, I think it was just like a WordPress blog of some
A
kind.
blog, yeah.
Yeah. And she would post very frequently, almost daily. It was just, she doesn't have the website now. I don't know what happened. I think it collapsed somehow. She's since started up again, but it was just, you could sit and read it for weeks. And everything I read, every blog post, there was something in it that resonated with me and
Mm,
then would, cause me to further go within and ask myself if I, resonated with that and if that was my story too. And so much of it was like, not all of it, but quite a bit. And so, yeah, definitely her writing really moved me forward, as well as a woman by the name of Annie Lobert. Her
her
organization,
too, yeah.
yeah, Hookers for Jesus in the States.
Yeah, yeah.
She put out a documentary, and I wish I could remember the name of it right in this moment, but it was a film basically that she had a hand in making, that really sort of followed her around and kind of looked into her reflections as an exited woman and one that became an abolitionist who's trying to reach back. And I just really felt inspired by that, and like, okay, there is another way to go forward and use what we have learned in this industry and the education and the exposure and insights, and not have it go to waste. You can still have something that comes from this, like it wasn't all this wasted time. You can
Yes,
change
yeah,
the world in some good way because of it.
yeah. What, hearing them, was it like they were giving words to things you already sort of felt inside, but you know how you hear someone say something and you're like, yes, like I've always kind of knew that, but I didn't articulate it as well as that person just articulated it. Was it like that?
Absolutely, because I was
Mm,
still in those competing narratives. I was still
mm,
in the fog, but the fog was starting to clear. So there's part of me that wants to go back to what's familiar and what I was so sure of for so
okay.
long, because that's all I had known. And it was a comfortable place until I had disrupted it and started to ask questions. And so it's like that at that point, you're looking for someone who is further along, that
Yeah.
has made sense of that and isn't in that state of questioning anymore. Like they're
Mm,
very certain about themselves, and I feel honored that I got to hear their testimony and could have those experiences shared with me, because I truly think that had I just kept been fed sex work ideology, I don't think I would have ever really got to that point of deep introspection and saying, you can do this, like you can make it, there's a different life, like it's going to be okay. And they gave me a lot of hope that there's something after the sex trade.
Yeah, yeah. Well, when you're talking, I'm thinking like it's almost like being in a cult or something, like where everyone around you, like they're all like when you go to work at the brothel, they're all kind of thinking like you are, and the owner of the brothel is there to make money. You're a commodity as well to them. But when you start questioning, like if you're in a cult, you're like, oh well, did the leader? Is it really true? And the leader said this or the leader said that, and people look at you like, oh, don't question, and until you really, so it's hard to think independently, and get out of that until you are pushed far enough, I suppose, or you start to get a different perspective. Or is that like a good analogy? Or
That is the best analogy. I say
oh,
that so often and it really angers a lot of people. And I even actually wrote a paper about it in 2021 for a publication called The Radical Notion. It's a bunch of fabulous radical
yeah,
feminists who
yeah,
have work that they put out
right,
under Dr. Jane Claire Jones. You might have
okay,
seen her online.
right.
But the paper that I wrote is actually called Sex Work Ideology as Cult-like Thought Reform.
Oh, okay, I had no idea.
Yeah,
I was thinking as you were talking about how that's how cults work, because that's how they keep
absolutely.
you trapped, is they don't encourage any independent thinking. And there's a uniformity of thought and ideology. And one of the rules is don't question that, right? And then
Yeah,
there's
and
also a security in that too, because there's us and them. You're part of the in group, and it's sort of safe and predictable in a certain sense. Like as horrifying and unsafe as your job was, there's still a familiarity to it in a sense that almost will keep you there, I suppose, right?
mhm. Yeah, like everything that you're saying is so much of what's in that paper, and it's
I
that
swear
stuff
I
like
haven't
us.
read it. Okay.
Yeah, I gotta send it to you. It's a paid prescription or subscription, not prescription, paid subscription. So yeah, a lot of people haven't actually seen that writing of mine, but it's actually one of my favorite pieces of work because I think people need to hear that. And just as you said, it's that us versus them thinking and strong arming, people of, okay, that's the enemy, but we have it figured out. And so many of the things when you look online and you say like characteristics of a cult, and you read through those, it's so many of them, probably about 80% are the same as sex work ideology. And once I saw that, I was like, somebody needs to kind of, tie this together because this is huge. Like, had someone told me early on, like, it's a cult and you are falling privy to it, I may have looked at it a little bit differently, but it's sold to us as this sisterhood and this form of like camaraderie,
Mm,
not as a cult. So it's like, again, us versus them, right? We have
yeah,
it figured out. They're all the crazy delusional
yeah.
ones, not
Well,
us.
and people in cults will say, hey brother, hey sister, that's how they refer.
Mm.
It's like this family type of thing, right?
Yeah. And once
That's
you're gone
so.
and out, you are exiled.
Oh,
You
that's
no
it. You're done.
longer,
You're
yeah.
shunned, right?
Yeah. Same thing with sex work ideology.
Yeah. I think it's so wonderful that you were able to write out about your experiences and articulate. You can just see the process of still in it, but questioning, thinking, reading other people exited, validating your ideas, making the transition out, and then further developing your thoughts about that. Back to just how you were different. So you said you were more honest with yourself. How are you different as a person? Emotionally, spiritually, mentally? How are you different as a person?
I'm more tender now. I'm much more emotional. And I kind of thought actually it would be the other way. I sort of thought
Mm,
that, years of dissociating and enduring unwanted touching just so that you can buy your groceries and put gas in your car, I really thought that that would harden me over time. But when I look back now, I can realize that the time that I was the hardest in my life, both on myself and in my compassion for humanity and others, was when I was active in the sex industry. And now, I don't know, like it's almost like once you let down that armor and that shell, you just have your raw self exposed, and that's a vulnerable state. And now, back then I would just look at it very superficially, right? Well, women are in the sex trade because we need money and it's a job like any other.
Right.
Now I think, who is that woman? Why is she there? What's her background? And I see people for much more than just a product or them going through a process. I see them, I think, more on a spiritual level, on a human seeing a human. And I think
Mm,
if all people did that, then I don't think we'd have exploitation, because you imagine yourself in that receiving position and it doesn't feel good.
mhm. Well, yeah, I'm hoping that uh, men that watch this who have paid for sex or have considered it will see that there's a human being on the other side of that transaction and not think superficially. You have to think superficially to be able to, engage in this kind of behavior, and it's not a superficial thing at all. But were you like tender and emotional like 1 year out? Because I'm thinking that would be maybe when you were the hardest and most cynical, like just coming out of it. But did that how did that process work out from hard and cynical to tender and emotional 10 years later?
I think it kind of came in waves. I think whenever I first came out, I was angry. I was really angry because it was finally the moment
Mm,
where I didn't have to continue doing that anymore and I could finally name the problem. Um, but then it would come like little waves of like compassion, because I think that those were like the seeds of compassion being planted back in me. So, I would be like, oh, these poor sex buyers, and like someone needs to love them still. But it was a lot of distorted compassion. It wasn't putting accountability where it needed to fall. And it was just starting to feel things again, was really what it was. So when you're just emotionally dead for so long, it takes a long time. It's not just like boom, you wake up and hey, now I feel again, now I care again. It's everything when you're exiting is again like lifting that fog. So today, 10 years out, I'm probably much more tender and gentle and empathetic than I've ever been. But it's definitely come in waves, and anger has been the other side to that wave. I'm either in this like deeply empathetic state where I'm like, oh my God, kumbaya,
right.
or I'm in this like very angry, resentful fighter, gotta fix this problem type mindset. And that's places to
Angry
go
at
with.
who? At who, Andrea? Or at what?
I think just the narrative, the social narrative, and the refusal for people to listen to that counter narrative that says, hey, maybe this isn't empowering. Hey, maybe this isn't what women want to do. And we aren't just these, you know, um, panting, hedonistic, sex starved women who just want to live our lives that way. We're actually humans who want to have connection and
Right.
deeper relationships. So it's been a big bounce from anger to empathy, and I'm still trying to balance that, but I feel I'm doing better probably now than I have previously.
Does that anger, so you talk about like that anger at the system or the structure in a way, but did that boil down to individuals, men as a gender, certain buyers that were particularly harmful or abusive to you?
No, and that actually kind of surprises me, to be honest, because
Mm,
I have met a lot of women who are exited and they are angry at the men, and rightfully so, right? They're angry at the person who has brought them the harm. But whenever I think you spend a lot more time reading and understanding social phenomenons, if you will, such as sex work ideology, you start to realize it's much bigger than the individual actors. And I have frustration for some of the things that were done to me because I have no option of any recourse. But I have forgiven the people who have wronged me, because when you know better, you do better. And I don't think those men were healthy. I don't think that they understood really what they were participating in. And some people might get upset with me and say they all understand and you have to hold them accountable. But when you really sit down with buyers and talk to them face to face, one on one, which I have been fortunate to do for the last decade through our John School here in Edmonton, I haven't met really any truly narcissistic, arrogant buyers um, that I think are beyond healing and happiness and repair, if you will. They're out there. I've entertained the narcissistic buyer, but they were so far and few. They really were. There wasn't that many. It was a lot of just hurting, sad men that
mhm.
were coming from a place of distorted, unhealthy masculinity.
Mhm.
And I think they're capable. And so you can't hold anger against someone when they're in this lower level of consciousness where they just haven't ascended to understanding what they're participating in and what is affecting them.
Yeah, there's so much what you said, like the lower level of consciousness. So it's seeing at a superficial level. This reflects my experience with my clients and sex buyers as well. That honestly, like they're just regular guys. Yeah, there's something. There's always a history or a story, and there's something going on in their lives, and there's a series of beliefs, or I call them thought distortions. Um, well, my interview with No Longer John, and he just talked about how there was a bunch of things that were going on in his life. He was disconnected, lonely, and unsatisfied. And then he watched the movie Pretty Women, and that led him to a whole slew of pro sex work ideology that literally indoctrinated him to normalize this. And then he went up and bought sex, right?
Yeah.
And then I had a client who was literally raised by a sex addict father who would get him to watch all of his porn videos while he was a teenager, to curate the best clips and put them together into sort of best, greatest hits of the porn, and took him to a brothel on his 16th birthday to make a man out of him. So there's a story for you. So guess what? He ended up being a porn and sex addict and paid for sex. Like it's almost like, how do you not end up being a sex buyer when you're literally raised like that as a child? So
Absolutely.
there's a lot of angles to it, but yeah, I'm very appreciative of your empathetic perspective and nuanced perspective on that. And I'm not making excuses for any of these guys at all. Okay, because everyone has problems in their lives, and going to pay for sex, there's other options than that are better. Okay.
Yeah, and
Um,
society wants to
but,
vilify them, right? Because you have to have a bad guy in the story. And whenever we talk about who the bad guy is, it's that social narrative that has become like this social contagion.
yeah.
And that is such a big mountain to climb. That is such a big, multifaceted problem. It's much
Mhm.
harder to address media distortions and, parental impacts and, you know, uh, yeah, intergenerational effects, like all those things. That is a bigger battle than just saying he paid for sex, he's a bad guy, get him.
Yeah.
And people want the quick fix and they want to do that. And, so when people also say, well, why do you want to see men get arrested? If you care about men, you should not want them to be criminalized if you acknowledge that they are like broken
Mhm.
men, you know?
Good point.
But I always say, yes, that's very true, but I don't support criminalizing men without alternative measures programming being offered to them after their arrest. Because we know from studies that the number one halter of men paying for sex is fear of arrest. That is the number one deterrent for all men. And unfortunately, if that's what it takes to get men to stop and have that moment where then someone can intercept and give them some information and also ask them to do some introspection and some soul searching, then that's what we have to do. And it is sad. Obviously, it's traumatic to be arrested. I've seen people get arrested. It's not fun.
Yeah.
And I don't want that on anybody. But if we can give these men programming, which we do through our John School with 8 hours of information and insights, we change lives. Like we really
Yeah.
see it in men. I've seen men break down sobbing. I've seen men,
Mhm.
just being so forthcoming with their truth and their struggles and asking for additional resources. And it's really a beautiful transformation, and that's their moment. And
Yeah.
I haven't seen many of them be resentful for their arrest. They've actually thanked the police officers at the John School for arresting them and
Mhm.
saying, I came
Yeah.
in here at the beginning of the day thinking, oh, my life is over, this is horrible, and I'm
Yeah.
leaving here feeling better about myself and having tools to
Yeah.
go forward. So yeah.
Yeah. I interviewed Hene Dolce. He's in Winnipeg, and
Yeah, he's
he's been
fabulous.
involved in John School. You know Hene?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And I think I'm saying, sorry, Hene, if I'm saying your name wrong. Hennis,
Tennis.
maybe
Yeah.
Hennis. Yeah. And saying he says the same thing, Andrea. you know, they come in like suicidal almost to the John School and leave having their eyes, you know, wide open. And this goes back to that awakening, the evolution of consciousness. You know, it's coming into a new level of understanding. And I think that's partly why, you know, I want to do these videos and make a podcast from this, so people can, you know, hear this and hear stories from people like you, so they can elevate their consciousness about this issue and their understanding about this issue. Because the other side's very busy. Well, I mean, mainstream media has bought it hook, line, and sinker, and that's all that's promoted there. So it's important to get a counter story out there. I think another story out, right? And yes, I had another question. It slipped away. Sorry, maybe we'll come back to it. Yeah, so a lot of women that come out of the industry report literally having PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Did this happen to you? Can you talk about that a little bit? What were the signs and symptoms of it? Why do you think you got PTSD? And then maybe talk about how you got some help with that or healed from that.
I think, you know, my journey is unique because I think any moment that I really started to experience trauma was, like I said, the last few years that I was in the industry, because prior to that, I had just kind of shelved everything. I was dissociated. So a lot of that trauma never actually permeated into me in the first years. It was almost like watching things happening, but they weren't actually happening to me. Because every time that I would be with a sex buyer, unbeknownst to me, I was subconsciously like leaving my body.
The
And
dissociating.
yeah, like it was almost like watching a film play out, you know? So when things
Wow.
happened, there was no emotional bond to me.
Right.
Like when a guy would choke me or bite me or slap me or spit on my vagina or, you know, whatever horrible thing they did, it really didn't carry an emotional weight with me. And so I was able to kind of continue on with my life and it wasn't really a problem. But it started having an impact once I was aware what dissociation was and when I could, as a result, no longer employ it. So that's when, you know, then you start doing the questioning, then you start doing the reflecting, and then you start thinking back to those instances. And that's almost the moment when the trauma seems to embed, is when you're like, oh my God, like someone did that. And that was my response. I didn't stand up for myself. You feel anger at yourself for allowing that to happen. You, of course, feel anger at the bigger system, everything. And so whenever I first exited, I think I was in such a state of feeling the injustice of, you know, the sex narrative, the sex work narrative, that I really wasn't experiencing trauma because I was so focused on how am I going to fight this fight? How am I going to help other women? How am I going to raise the consciousness of men so that something can change? And so for a long time, I really didn't think that the industry impacted me. I did have a lot of nightmares, multiple times a night, probably 3-4 times a night for years.
Oh,
And
wow.
still,
About like actual things that happened to you in the sex industry or just other things?
not really so much that, just like horrific nightmares of just violence. And even when the dream wasn't bad, it was this feeling of like impending doom and darkness. Like it was really strange. So I actually thought that I had a dream disorder. I thought I had like something called nightmare anxiety disorder.
Okay.
And so then I was also getting these like squeezing feelings throughout the day, almost like this, like somebody's grabbing you and squeezing you. And I would experience that a couple times a day. And I didn't know anything of what was happening. I just kind of was like, oh, I have this dream disorder and maybe I have anxiety and that's this feeling. And nothing I was going through was, to me, linked to the sex industry. It was all just something different because I had had this most of my life, all these dreams and this energy within me. And so I went and saw a psychiatrist, sorry, probably about 1.5 years, 2 years after exiting, and kind of described all this. And he did a test for PTSD because, as you know, there's like specific criteria.
Did he know your story, Andrea? Did you know your
Yeah,
specific history? Okay.
yeah. So I had gone and kind of told him everything. And I said, I think I have this dream disorder. And he said, I actually think that you have PTSD. And I'd had, relatives telling me that as well. My husband told me, oh yeah, you for sure have PTSD. But when I went and had this diagnosis done, I actually didn't meet the criteria of PTSD. And I think that
Really?
I was
Well,
missing
I'm
a couple of things.
surprised.
I think it was the flashbacks. I wasn't having flashbacks of incidences. And there was one other thing that disqualified me from that. But I was diagnosed then with hyperactivity disorder, ADHD.
Oh,
So then after that, I thought, well, I have no trauma, right? I just have ADHD. So
oh,
that
did you meet any of the criteria for PTSD, or just because,
no,
or just
no.
not enough to get a diagnosis? Because you have to have a certain amount of
Yeah,
criteria.
well, he had said obviously everybody for the most part has some degree of trauma, but that PTSD and CPST, CPT,
Chronic,
yes, yes,
yeah,
I'm like too many
chronic
acronyms.
PTSD.
Yes, that one he said it's very specific. So he kind of just said, I just think you have ADHD and just, general frustrations in life. And I don't think he was really well trauma informed when it comes to commercial sexual exploitation.
Oh,
So
okay.
after that, I kind of just thought, well, it's just ADHD with some anxiety. But then I think it was about a year ago, a new therapist that I've been seeing, because I've only been in therapy now, actual therapy for a year and a half. She diagnosed me with unspecified trauma and stressor related disorder. So it is a form of trauma, but it doesn't, again, meet the criteria of PTSD. And when I started seeing her, same thing, I kind of told her my story and she said, I'm going to test you for PTSD because I'm certain that you have it. And so she ran me through everything again. And after she goes, I'm actually very shocked, but you don't have PTSD. And she said, I think you might be one of the first people that has come out of the industry that's in therapy, that I've met that doesn't have it. So
Mm.
yes, something different, I guess, unspecified trauma and stressor related disorder, which I don't know the difference really, but it's obviously some form of trauma.
So, what did you do after that in terms of therapy? Like, did you talk about your experiences? Did you relive them? Did you do a particular type of therapy and did it help you? What did and didn't help you?
Well, whenever I started out with her, because she obviously doesn't know my story and my journey, I think every form of therapy starts out with talk therapy, just because you need to kind of fill in the therapist as
Mm,
to, the many layers and the many experiences.
sure.
So it was about a year that I did talk therapy with her. And um, I think for me, just having been someone who has really dived into this topic in an academic sense and from a mental health perspective and a spiritual sense and all these things, talk therapy really wasn't giving me anything because I have shared my story for 10 years. I have written about my story. I've studied everything. I've read other people's stories. Like it really wasn't doing anything. So I said to her, I appreciate that it's been a year of talk therapy, but I feel almost like, sort of like that book, right? Like trauma lives in the body. I can't remember exactly now who wrote that gentleman,
Just
but
the Body Keeps Score by Besser Vanderkolk.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, maybe
yeah.
that's it.
So maybe that was it. Yeah. I
Or
think it, yeah,
Peter Levine's written a few too, Waking the Tiger. Maybe it's him, The Body Keeps the Score. It's one
I
of those
think
two.
it is. Yeah. And maybe it's a subtitle like Trauma Lives in the Body, or maybe that was a
Yeah.
point from the book. But yes, thank you. That's the book. Um, so reading excerpts from that as well and kind of understanding it and thinking to myself, like, talk therapy hasn't helped, but it's almost like there's something in me that won't leave. Like it's this, I kind of call it like the little gremlin. And that was how I described it to my therapist. It's like this little person inside you that like reaches up and like squeezes your body and like punches your guts from the inside and just makes you, it's like this little monster that you just can't rid yourself of. And maybe that is trauma, maybe that's that thing that keeps coming back to hurt you or bother you. But she said, well, maybe we need to move into doing somatic therapy. And so that's more so, the body work and getting out of your mind and actually getting into your emotions and processing them. And in general, I have a really hard time dealing with emotions. I don't do good with them. And maybe a lot of that is the sex trade as well, too, of just numbing out from emotions.
Right.
But we started doing some of the somatic therapy, and it was really, really helpful. And I continue to do it now. And kind of a long story, and I'll try to keep it short. But one of the sessions, she said to me, like, tell me what it feels like. And so I told her, it's like this little gremlin, like, pulling at me. And she said, well, what I want you to imagine is that this little gremlin has this wheel, and he's cranking it, and he's inside you, and he's pulling everything down. It's this tightness in your chest. It's this, this buildup of something, and this, you need to release it. So I want you to imagine him like cranking this and cranking this, and it's getting tighter and tighter. And she had put me almost into this like semi-hypnotic state. And so I'm envisioning this little person cranking this. And she said, now I want you to suddenly think that the spool has just snapped, and now it's back spinning, and everything gets this instant release. It breaks, and you go from there. And when she had me do that, I was really in the moment, and I felt it, and it happened. And I instantly just started sobbing, like just
Right.
tears, like, and I probably cried for about 2 minutes straight of just this heavy weeping.
Yeah.
And so then I kind of come out of this, and I'm like, oh my God, like, sorry, emotional breakdown.
Yeah.
And she goes to
It
me, that's
surprised you, right? You weren't expecting that, right?
not at all. And she said, that's what we call a trauma bleed. You just bled out years worth of trauma in that moment.
Wow, that's powerful.
It was so powerful. And
Wow.
I felt so good after that for
Yeah.
probably 2 weeks. Like, I was
Like
untouchable.
lighter, like just better
Yes.
mood, lighter, free.
Everything. Yeah. It was
Okay.
just like so much of what I'd been carrying was just physically released from my body, because mentally I've released it years and years ago, and I've
Right.
reasoned with it, and I've done all those things to make sense of it. But this was that physical, like, letting it
Right.
out, and
Yeah.
I've tried to release that in other ways, years of long distance running.
Yes, I know
Meditation.
you're a runner as well. I attempt running.
Yeah,
You actually do 10K runs. I have done one 10K run this year, but
that's
yeah,
great. But
yeah, of
we look for ways to give that physical release, right? We all
course,
do.
yeah.
And
And the
so,
dopamine and the adrenaline, and that all
yeah.
feels good. Did you have more than one release experience like that, or was it kind of
That,
that one and done? It's like, did you
yeah,
feel
that
like,
was,
yeah, that got the gremlin out? Is the gremlin gone now?
I don't think so, but I think that
Be
was like,
smaller, weaker?
yeah, I feel like that specific little gremlin, I'll say, is
Yeah,
gone, whatever that was in that moment. Because like, she didn't tie it to any experience. It was just going within the body and being
yeah,
present in the body and feeling that. And so, when that released, maybe he's still there, but that one spool that he's
yeah,
cranking is broken. Or maybe he's gone, but his friends are there. Like, I
yeah,
don't know. It's still such a new journey for me, but it was just this very cathartic,
yeah.
freeing feeling, and it gave me a lot of relief. And so I plan to continue doing somatic therapy, and just hope to.
Are you still going for that?
Yeah, I've been in intense therapy for now a year and a half, like, every week or every second week, and trying to do that. And it's helped, but it's hard when you're a mind-centered person rather than a heart or emotional centered person. It's hard to get in that space sometimes.
But was there a process of and I'm not assuming you ever hated yourself. I'm asking, right? But was there a process of having self-hatred or hating yourself to self-love, coming into self-love? Or
um
is that not how you kind of operate, or how your brain works, or
I
the
can I
yeah,
can look back now and recognize that I hated myself. And
yeah,
I think it takes courage for people to say that, because if I truly loved myself, I wouldn't have, well, I don't know, it's hard to say, right? Like, I feel like I hated myself back then. Maybe I didn't, because maybe I was in the moment doing what I thought was best for me and what would benefit me. And then to me, it was an act of self-preservation and self-love of, okay, you need money to survive. Let's do what we have to do to give you that financial security, that socioeconomic security. But looking back now, I think, that there was definitely low self-esteem, self-hatred to some degree, that I really thought that was the only way that I could help myself or repair my situation. Like, I didn't even look into things like claiming bankruptcy, which now, looking back, a person who loves themselves would claim bankruptcy before they would let thousands of men pay to rape them, essentially. So once you know better, you do better. And I still struggle with loving myself, because, of course, when you speak out, you get a lot of attacks then too. So you have people telling you every day that you're a piece of garbage, that you're an abuser, that you're a phony, that you're, some renegade, that you're a, virtue signaler, like just throw on any name of any attack. And when you have people saying that to you, when you're still in a state of recovery, because for many of us, recovery is forever.
Yeah, it's
It's
it's an ongoing
very,
process then.
yeah. So it does build up. And, I have the self-love now to look at those comments and think to myself, that's a damaged person. And what they say
Yeah,
isn't actually true about me. But when you're in that constant environment of it being said to you over and over and over and over,
yeah.
eventually the energy of that, not the words of that, not the people saying those words, but the energy of that does start to sink in.
You're
And it
talking
does,
about Twitter, aren't you?
well, Twitter and just,
Didn't you just go off Twitter?
yeah, for a couple months. But even in my email, like people would find my scholarly writings and they would email me like, just harsh
It's
things. And
email?
yeah, like, because it has my email in my papers
Yeah.
and
Who are
everything.
these people? Are they pro sex work? Are they in the
Men, they're
industry?
all they're all men. I've
They're
never
men.
actually, yeah, I've never had a woman reach out to me hating on me, except for the odd woman on Twitter who I
Twitter,
think
yeah,
is, you know,
yeah.
in her state. But yeah, it's that
Because
the
you're
challenges of
challenging
it.
their
Yeah.
primitive conceptions of reality, basically. And so it's easier to be angry than to look at themselves.
Hmm. Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's a lash out, because again, all the healthy men who I have these conversations with, they can find some point in that story or in my sharing that resonates with them and that they identify with. But a broken man, they can't, because they're not as far along on that healing continuum that I've now gotten to. So for
Yeah.
them, it's threatening language. It's so far out of their peripheral that, like you said,
Mhm.
it's easier to hate on it than to examine and explore that.
Yeah. So since coming out, you've got married, have 3 children?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Mm.
How has it affected you just in terms of connecting with those close to you in your life? Being intimate with your husband, being present for your children. What can you share about that?
That's probably been my biggest struggle, is for I think for a lot of people, they aren't afforded the opportunity that I was as a means of exiting. And really the opportunity that I was afforded to exit was marriage. And it's sad to say that, because you look back and you always want to say, I did it myself, right? I got myself out, I finished my degree, I got a good paying job that could sustain me and myself, my children, if you have them. You always want to feel like you've done it for yourself, but really there's always the 3 Ps, I call them, that hold women under thumb. It's either our parents, we're either under them, where we are their child, we're living in their care. And then for a lot of us, when we exit that, if we can't make it on our own, which I didn't make it past 5 years of being out of high school before I was in prostitution. So, you go from the parents, and then really for a lot of women, it's either partnership, the other P, or it's prostitution in some regard, whether that's OnlyFans or full on brothel participation. It's the 3 Ps: parents, prostitution, and partnership. And for a lot of women, that's our only options in life when you really get down to it, because of things like, women's economic subjugation and marginalization. And so for me, I was, one of the luckier ones where it was partnership. It was a kind guy, not a, abusive man, but like a good husband that, helped move me out of there and helps me to have that, equal partner and that solid foundation, where I didn't feel like my first husband, where I had to pay for his livelihood and support him and myself. And
Mm,
someone who was an equal partner. So I think a lot of women don't have that, and some women don't want that, right? They don't want to feel like they were saved by a man, because for me it was the right thing, but there's still, again, that feeling of, well, I didn't do it by myself. And so that of course adds to your low self-esteem, that you couldn't even get yourself out of that situation. It had to be a man to get you out, when for the
mm.
last 7 years prior to that, it was men who were keeping me there too. And it's hard. So I'm very fortunate, but in the same breath, it frustrates me because I think that women
Mm,
should be able to exit without needing some outside influence, for that to happen, and for it to be successful when it
mhm,
happens.
mhm.
But connecting it's hard because I really went from, being a brothel owner 7 years, like a quarter of my life, having sold sex, to then all of a sudden I'm a wife, and within, less than 5 years, I'm a mom of three. And
Like
so,
3 kids in 5 years?
yeah,
Mm,
yeah, 3 kids in 4.5 years. So
okay,
it was really
big
different. And of
transition.
course, yeah, and a lot of body changes with that too, right? Like when
Mm,
you're so used to your body not being your own in the sex trade, and then all of a sudden your body is not your own again, through
right.
pregnancy and nursing and all those
Mm,
things that are, to some degree, have that sexual link to them.
right,
That was hard too. Like I know a lot of women who are exited that become mothers that cannot nurse their baby because it's the idea of somebody being on your breast suckling, which prior to then it's been sex buyers. And so it takes you back, and it's these triggering things of
right.
dissociation. And it was hard. It was really hard. And I feel very well now with my children, but it's been a journey. I've always been present, I've always been loving and giving, but I've always kind of felt like it wasn't fully authentic from me because I felt like I wasn't whole. So if
Mm,
I wasn't whole, how could I give my whole self as a mother and really truly emotionally bond with my kids? So it's getting better, and they've never suffered, I don't think, on account of it, because
mm,
we're good at hiding those things and faking it till you make it, so to speak. But
mhm.
yeah, it's hard whenever it's something, again, that ties to emotional vulnerability and physical giving, of someone always grabbing at you and touching you. And then expectations within marriages of ongoing regular sex, when sometimes that's a challenge for women with past like mine.
Yeah, is it, and feel free to not answer if you're not comfortable. I'm not looking for details, but did it, how could I say it, ruin sex? Like being in the industry ruin sex for you? Like even relational, connected, intimate sex with a loving partner? Is that, yeah, how do you feel about that?
I think, again, it's come and gone in waves for me.
Comes and goes, eh? Okay.
Yeah, I think like whenever I first exited, it was something so unique because there was emotion to it. There
Mm,
was, a foundation of love there, of mutuality, of respect, of all those great things. So I think it was very easy to dive into that and be swallowed up into that and be like, wow, like I'm back in what is healthy sexuality and normalness.
right.
But then, of course, when you start to go back to re-examine things from your past, and you start pulling it all apart and trying to, unravel it and work through that trauma, of course, when you're in that space again and you put yourself in that, there will always be that carryover that
Mhm.
comes to your life now. And I know, for the first 2 years that I was out of the industry, it was so challenging for me to have sex, even though I felt those emotions for my husband and wanted to connect with him. I always had to tell myself, he's not a client. This is
Right.
not work. Like this, you have to be present. Stop doing this and posing that way, and stop saying
Sure.
this and going through your act, if you will. Like you
Yeah.
actually have to be mindful and be present and
Mm,
connected.
mhm.
And when you struggle to do that in general, and then you add on sex trade experience where you really didn't do any of that, it's hard for that to come back and to just be like, I'm fine, everything's normal, this is a healthy sex life. it I know so many women that say, I will never have normal healthy sex because I have at one point been a sexual object. So
Wow.
we all, I think, work through it. I don't think I've met one woman who doesn't slip back into that dissociated state, or sometimes even say to themselves, why am I having sex for free? I should be getting paid for this. It's seen
Right.
as a form of labor because we told ourselves for so long that's a form of labor. So
Yeah.
it's a lot to work through. But yeah, it's getting better. And I think also coming back into my body through the somatic therapy has helped.
Mhm, mhm.
But yeah, still an ongoing challenge. And I'm very fortunate to have a patient partner that gets it and doesn't hold those expectations against me or
Mhm.
anything like that.
Oh, thanks so much for being open and vulnerable, Andrea, about that. What would you say to women, let's just say women, rather than men, that are considering some kind of sex for money lifestyle, whether it's, OnlyFans is the latest uh, thing going on, you know, f- or just, straight into working in a brothel or doing out calls, being an escort. Let's say they're going into school and they're thinking, it's going to cost me $80,000 to get this degree. I'm going to work for 15 bucks an hour at Starbucks and graduate with all this debt. I can just do a bit of sex work for a couple of years and literally pay for my schooling. And on the surface, that kind of has a certain sort of logic to it, I guess, if you think superficially. But as someone that's lived through this, what would you say to that person, or to you at 22? Like, if you could go back and talk to yourself at that age of considering going into it.
Yeah, I appreciate that second part of what you said because I often get asked, like, what would you say to other women? And I struggle with that because I don't think it's my place to tell any woman, don't do this. You shouldn't do this. Do I want them to do it? Of course not, because I'm now further along and I have more tools and I have more uh, ability to reflect on everything. And I can see now that the money I made isn't worth what happened to me
Right.
and what I carry for the rest of my life. And, I'll probably spend a good chunk of that money that I made trying to heal from that money making venture with
Right.
therapy, which is not cheap.
Yeah.
And, all those things. So I never want to tell a woman what to do because I'm not her and I don't have to pay her bills. And, for some women, maybe that sacrifice is worth it. Maybe the fear of money and of poverty and, being homeless, that is more scary to them than possibly living with sexual trauma. So I think we all weigh our options and we try to go with that which is the best, most beneficial for us. And, alleviates as much suffering or harm that could come. But I think the problem that exists is that there isn't an honest conversation about just how much that harm does exist. And
Right.
that's really why I try to debunk sex work ideology or at least provide a counter narrative of someone who once was a full on heavy, heavy supporter of the ideology and a strong supporter of full decriminalization as a legal response.
Mhm.
So I think, if people can hear that counter narrative, it at least gives them that little bug in the ear that says to them, maybe that's not true. Maybe what you're hearing is glorified. Maybe that's being sensationalized to suck you in.
Mhm.
And I always say, I think if I had had exposure to that counter narrative, I would not have swam as deep as I did in the Kool-Aid. I would have probably still ended up in the sex industry because I didn't know what would come after. I couldn't
Mhm.
appreciate now what I know now.
Mhm.
And I was young and I was desperate for money. So I can't say I wouldn't have done it, but I truly believe had I had exposure to that counter narrative, that I wouldn't have really been swallowed up so much by it, which
Mhm.
ultimately would have made it so I probably didn't stick around as long as I did. I would have been more focused on meeting my goals and exiting. I
Mhm.
definitely would have never opened a brothel,
Mhm.
thinking that that was harm reduction or helpful to people. So I think it's a slippery slope. Like, I think women do have to navigate patriarchy. We live in patriarchy, and sometimes that means compromising ourselves. And, unfortunately, we do what we have to do. But when we glorify it and when we minimize the repercussions of these decisions, we're really not doing any justice to anyone for them to have a true choice in the matter because they don't have all the facts, they don't have all the information. And I know that my story isn't universal. There's going to be some people that leave and look back on their time fondly. And maybe they only did OnlyFans and they made a ton of money and they never were actually touched or invaded by someone. And to them, it was worth it. It was the balance.
Yeah.
But I think for people that really end up in the deepest part of the industry, which is that in-person private, penetrative
Yeah.
sex with a stranger, that's a whole nother world. That's not like OnlyFans, and OnlyFans, of
Right.
course, has its issues. Like you're visibly more there online versus if you're in a back room, like more people
Mhm.
will see you as a sex seller
Mhm.
than they would if you're in private. But it's a very different experience to take some pictures of your feet or of your
Mhm.
vagina and post them online versus actually having somebody, thousands of men, one after another, come and actually use those body parts and
Mhm.
orgasm because of you and on you. And
Mhm.
that's a different game. So it's a slippery slope where we start out with OnlyFans, and it's very competitive. Not many women make much more than a couple $100 a month on OnlyFans, the majority. So then when
Right.
you still have those debts and you've already taken the plunge and you put yourself out there, the next
Yeah.
logical thing is to go to where you're going to make the most money, which is that in-person
Well,
one-on-one
and once
session.
you're up on OnlyFans, you're going to be actively recruited by pimps and
Hmm.
people that will want to get you to do escorting and webcamming or take it to the next level, right?
Yep.
That's
Yes.
my understanding anyway. So yeah, well, I think it's a very balanced and wise answer. And I mean, I think if people just have listened carefully to your story and the first interview, they should be able to put it together themselves. If I choose to do this, let's say, actually sell sex for money one on one with people, this is what is going to happen. Not
Yeah.
all of it, but some of it.
Hmm.
I will be treated as an object. I will be disrespected. My boundaries will be violated. I think these are probably universal statements for anyone doing this,
I
right?
think so too. Yeah.
It will affect my self esteem, my self love. I'm risking physical harm, tears to my body, being choked, catching a disease, being physically abused.
Hmm.
And this is when I tell people, well, that sex work is work. I'm like, okay, give me one more job tell me one job where this is an expectation or a hazard of the job,
Hmm.
right? And of
Yeah.
course, there isn't any because it's not really a job, is
No,
it?
no.
And yeah, I mean, one of my questions was, what would you say to sex work? People that promote sex work, but I mean, unless you can think of some data, I think we sort of covered that.
Yeah. I think for a lot of them, they're still just swimming deep in that
Swimming in
moment.
the
And they
Kool-Aid.
still, yeah, and I know people take offense to that and they say, oh, don't paint me as a victim. Like, I'm not someone who just hasn't come to yet and realized it yet.
Mhm.
And maybe that's true. Maybe they do realize it. And perhaps for them, it just hasn't compounded enough for it to actually have a noticeable effect in them.
Well,
And
and I think I don't know why people get offended at that argument because we accept it in other areas of life. Like I smoked for 20 years and then I just kind of woke up and like, this is killing me. I have to quit. So
mhm,
there's an elevation of consciousness. Or I was 50 pounds overweight for 15 years and then my doctor was going to put me on diabetic medication and something happened. It's like my eyes open. I'm like, I can't do it. I can't do this anymore. Like we
yeah.
know that this happens all the time to people. So why would we be offended when we talk about this, right?
Yeah, and that always astounds me is like, why is this conversation so protected?
Yeah,
And even with like full decriminalization, that argument, like they say, we want no laws, we want just absolutely nothing, just let the market govern itself. And I'm
right.
like, listen, like look at the market for the most part right now does govern itself.
Mm,
It's a underground activity by large that a lot of
yeah.
people really don't have, a firsthand insight into. And look at what's happening. And now we want to go even further with no light being shone on this in any kind of way. Like, is that actually the answer to harm reduction? And
Mm,
I really struggle with that because yes, I believe, for me, it took a lot to just reach that tipping point. And it was a lot of tiny little catalysts that finally had that compounding effect that just happened to push me over the edge. And then after that, it was like, whoa, downhill I go, but
yeah.
and it's not to say that people aren't intelligent or introspective, but the longer you do something, the more to some degree of an expert you become on that, and a better understanding of it that you have.
Mhm,
So when we say, oh, listen to active sex workers, women who have been in the industry for 3 months, they're not going to have the same narrative that they would if you listen to an active sex worker of 10, 15, 20 years in that industry. And I
mhm,
find a lot of those older women, they're not disillusioned about what they're participating in. Most of them, they have come to see the light, so to speak, but they just are not at a position to change their lives. And so they
mhm,
stay there. And, then they become, unfortunately, quite cynical or very traumatized because they're aware. But it's these
yeah.
young, eager, fresh out the gate. This is great. This is work. I'm making a ton of money. Of course,
Mhm,
they're going to say it's great. And why are we prioritizing them versus those who really have had a really long journey through this and can see it for what it is. And I find that part frustrating too. You know, people say you're not an active seller, so your opinion doesn't matter anymore. Well, if you had asked me, you know, 6 months in if I liked it, you would have heard a completely different story than what you hear today, now that the money's gone and, you know, that that fog has been lifted.
Yeah. No, so true. Well, one last question, Andrea. If you have a few more minutes,
Sure.
I'd like to catch up on what you've been involved in since leaving. I know there's, you know, you and I keep in touch, and there's some projects, films. You do a lot of activism. I know you've spoken at Parliament before. So why don't you just give us a little bit idea of what you got cooking there and some of the fun stuff, or I don't know how fun it is, but you know, passion projects. Passion projects. Is that a good way to say it?
Yeah, yeah, I think
Yeah.
so.
What
Um,
what you got cooking?
I think right now, honestly, is probably the quietest that things have been for me. And that's because I've made it that way.
Mm,
I was really starting to compromise my family life by just giving way too much to the work and trying to raise awareness and trying to publish numerous papers and trying to speak at every conference that I was invited to, and you know, accommodate anyone that wanted to talk about it. And I really was not giving myself some kind of balance.
right. Well,
And
thanks for making time for me, by the way, because
always,
I know
always,
you're flooded with requests to speak and whatnot, so I do really appreciate it.
I always have time for you, Paul, for sure. And I feel bad, you know, because I want to say in the last 2 months that I've really, like you said, I've left Twitter in 2 months ago and just kind of said no. I've been going so hard at this for 2 years publicly, in addition to, you know, the almost 8 years I was doing it not online, that it was just it almost became heightened. Like it was really actually pretty good for the first 7, 8 years there. And then once I was like, I'm going to take it to Twitter and go level 10.
Toxic
Um,
wasteland of Twitter. Oof,
yes,
you survive,
yeah.
right?
And also when you put yourself out there more, you get more people reaching out, trying to collaborate with you, which is beautiful. And I appreciate that. And I'm
Yeah.
very grateful, but you have to have that
Well,
balance. And
that's how I met you actually, was on Twitter.
oh
So
yeah,
I'm
that's
glad that
right.
you were still on Twitter. I think I just DM'd you one day and we started talking. Yeah.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't,
Hmm.
didn't think of that.
Yeah.
But you know, so you want to obviously accommodate everybody, but you can't. Like, you have to find that balance. And I wasn't finding that balance, and I was slipping back into anger again. And
Right.
I was like, you know, I just need to lean towards the light for a little bit. And
Right.
so, as you know, I'm training for a marathon right now and just trying to
Oh,
do
awesome.
peaceful good things that are not
Hmm.
all doom and gloom and exploitation and misogyny and violence and
Right.
everything, which it's
It
been
is heavy. It's heavy stuff, eh? To constantly
yeah,
be thinking about and writing about.
yeah.
Yeah.
So I was like, okay, I'm gonna just kind of scale it back, still do a lot of activism, which I enjoy doing, but not take it on such a public, you know, forum like Twitter.
Right.
So yeah, I think in the last 2 months I've turned down probably 11 or 12 podcast interviews. I was invited to speak at like North America's largest summit about exploitation, and I declined that,
Right.
which, you know, it just sometimes you just have to say there'll be another year. I can do it another year, but
They'll ask you again next year probably. So
yeah, I hope so. Yeah, they do good work.
tell us about the film that's been film project.
Yeah, that's a huge, huge project. It was started, well, so I spent 7 years active in the industry, and then on the anniversary of my 7 years of being exited, we started, that was day one of filming. And so
Oh
this film
wow. So it's
project,
been going on 3 years now.
yeah, yeah, 2.5 years of filming. We
Was
have
it a documentary, like an independent filmmaker doing a documentary on your life, or?
So, well, what had happened, actually, it's kind of a long story, which everything is, it seems, with this stuff. But what had happened was, when I was selling sex, I went to America with a regular of mine who's a local surgeon here in Edmonton. And he was going to a conference and had invited me along. And I was stopped at the border. I was interrogated for probably almost 7 hours in this tiny room. And then they,
7 hours?
yeah, no lawyer. I couldn't call a lawyer.
But
No
what?
food, no drink, on
Oh,
suspicion of prostitution.
oh, I see.
So being an honest person, I didn't deny anything. And obviously at the time I owned a studio, so there was no point in trying to lie. So I said, yes, I'm licensed. This is all above board. My city approves of this. Like, why am I being interrogated? And they said, well, in America, it's illegal to both buy and sell sex. So you're banned from America now. We are coining you as a prostitute in the US system of immigration, and we're going to photograph you and fingerprint you. And here's a 10-year ban. And
Wow.
yeah, so this happened to me in January of 2010.
Okay.
And so the buyer that I was invited by, they didn't do anything to him. They did pull him aside and said, were you planning to pay for sex with this individual? And he said, yes. And they said, okay, well, you have a conference that you're going to in America? And he said, yep. And they said, okay, well, you're going to miss your flight. We'll call ahead and tell the gate to wait for you. And they
Why does he get off scot-free?
misogyny and patriarchy in a nutshell. But and looking back, like, I don't wish bad upon him as well. Like, he was one of the more respectful and I guess above board buyers that I had.
It just doesn't seem equitable though, does
That was the issue with me, is like, why are the sellers, again, as with history, being made to bear that weight when we're not seeing it really on the side that's generating this activity, which is the demand for it. So 10 years I had this ban, and I thought, okay, January 2020, my ban lifts, which is what I was told 10 years after. And so 10 years after arrives, and I'm now married with children. And, my oldest is saying, I want to go to Disneyland. And so my husband and I were thinking about taking them there. And I called Customs and Border Protection. And I said, can you just look in my file? Like, will I be stopped at the border if I go through? And they said, yes, you will, because I told them I exited December 19th, 2012. So they said the 10-year ban is not 10 years from when you were stopped at the border. It's 10 years from when you can prove that you have exited the sex industry. So now 10 years after being out, after becoming published and working as an advocate for many years, and everything I had done in, that 7 years roughly, all of a sudden now I'm told, no, you're banned for ultimately another 3 years, essentially. So
it'd be December of this year that the 10 years will be up.
yeah. Yeah. So I really felt like that was an injustice and wasn't okay. I said, like, how far do I have to go to be rehabilitated in their eyes, when really I was just a woman trying to survive and was a completely different person? Like, how much further do I have to go to prove that I'm not a national security threat?
Right.
I
So
just
the
reached
film's
out.
about your story, and the center of the story is being stopped at the border.
Yeah, that's kind of
All
the
that.
thing, is me trying
Right.
to get America to absolve me of this waiver
Okay.
requirement, because every year,
Right.
if I want, I can pay about anywhere from $800 to $1,500 a year to get this waiver. And they will give you basically a year where you can travel to America. And if you don't have the waiver, you don't get it. So it's really a
Oh,
cash grab system of,
cash grab. Yeah.
of impoverished women by large. So,
Right. Yeah.
and a
Yeah.
very gendered practice and
Right.
everything.
And
So,
by the way, is it still legal in Edmonton to run a brothel?
Um, well, technically it's not legal anywhere in Canada as per the Protection of
Oh,
Communities and
is it
Exploited Persons Act. But yes,
licensed then still?
Edmonton is still actively circumventing our federal legislation to license sexual exploitation.
How do you feel
So
about that?
yeah, it's frustrating because, we look at Winnipeg. Winnipeg actually just recently said we will no longer license these establishments. We're not going to go in and raid them. We're not going to, shutter the doors instantly, but we're going to work with social agencies, and we're going to try to connect with the people and naturally dissolve this industry as much as we can, but we are not going to sanction it any longer in the city of Winnipeg. And I think a lot of that work was Diane Red Sky, very prominent Indigenous activist, as well
Mhm.
as Hennis. I think Hennis had a
Yes.
hand in that as well too. So, they
He's
did good
taught a
work.
bunch of stuff. He's always working on different things, Hennis. I know I haven't
Yeah,
talked in a while, but
yeah.
yeah.
But
Yeah.
they came together and they basically said, we know it's a problem, we know it's going to exist, but we don't need to
Yeah.
legally sanction it. And so
Right.
I really hope that Edmonton can look to Winnipeg and start looking at how we can change this social narrative and accept that, yes, we're still going to see this activity, but we don't need to be pouring gasoline on the fire and trying to normalize what is violence against women ultimately.
Yeah.
So the film, yeah, I'm kind of the, I guess, the grounding story in the film, but it started off intended to be just a 90-minute documentary kind of following my journey to have the states lift this prostitute label off of me. And it ended up now we have a 8 1-hour episode docu-series. So we have 8 episodes, and it is just, yeah, it's been over 500 hours of footage that we have recorded. I think over 80 shoots, probably about 50 interviews in total. We've got active buyers, former buyers, same thing with sellers, active and former, receptionists who never sold but were in that environment. MP Arnold Beerson is in there. Edmonton Police.
Arnold, yeah.
Yeah, Dale McPhee, our chief of police, he's in it. Kate Quinn, executive director of Cease here, In Demand organizations, hotel association CEOs, like everybody talking about it in every capacity. A lot of Indigenous voices, the trans experience,
Wow.
any stone that you can think of, we have not left it unturned.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you know, I really feel like that's what we need to do. Like it needs to have 8 hours really for people to understand. Like a little 90-minute film just didn't
Sounds like
feel
it's really grown from the initial concept to more
Yeah.
inclusive, you know, inclusive of a lot more of the broader issues, right?
It is, yeah. So that film
That's
is
exciting, Andrea. It's really
Thanks.
exciting.
Yeah.
Like, come on, get it done. I want to see it.
I know. Well, it's called Labeled, the film, and there's a really prominent US film festival happening in January. So we are hoping to meet the deadline. We should meet the deadline for submission to it at the end of
Yeah.
August.
Where is it? I'll go watch it.
Yeah, well, we don't know if it ends up on the film circuit, if it gets picked up and accepted by the film
You
festivals.
give me
Then,
the details. How about the Toronto Film Festival? TIFF. Want to see
Yeah.
that? TIFF, okay.
Yeah, we just missed the cutoff for TIFF. That was our
Oh.
goal. So our new goal is Sundance Film
I would
Festival.
love to meet you at TIFF for the screening of your film. How awesome would that be?
That would be great.
We've
And
never
then,
met. For people that know, I live in Ontario, Canada, and Andrea's in Edmonton, Alberta. So she's 1,000 miles away. We've never met, but it'd be wonderful to do that.
yeah, I know we've tried to connect in person. I said I'm coming out east, and then it doesn't happen, and stuff
Yeah.
like that. But yeah, hopefully you'll
Well,
see it.
and COVID didn't help the last 2 years of that going on either. So
Yeah,
we'll make it
Yeah.
happen sometime.
and then I have a book as well that I'm doing with Kathy
do?
King. Yeah, it's a book, and it'll be called Buying Sex: Who Really Pays.
Oh,
And,
I love it. Love that title.
Yeah, that
Is
it's a
Kathy
lovely.
King a survivor, an exited woman as well? Or?
No, actually, her daughter is one of Canada's missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Oh, wow.
Her daughter unfortunately lost her life over 20 years ago.
Oh, wow.
We don't know if it was a buyer or perhaps a sadistic drug dealer or somebody, but yeah, she had some challenges and was on Edmonton streets for a while, and then was one of the women that was or had her remains found outside of Edmonton. So
Oh,
very sad story. Kathy King is she's really an idol to me. She is one of the most resilient and articulate and brave and just compassionate woman from just everything that she has endured. I just stand in awe of her. And so one day I said to her, hey, we should write a book. Like there isn't really a Canadian focus on the commercial sex industry. We see a lot coming out of America and some out of Australia and overseas, but there's not really a lot of Canadian literature that is specific to Canada. And so I said we should write a book. And being so busy with the film, I connected with Kathy, I think like a month or two later, and she basically had the skeleton outline of this book ready to go. And I said, oh my gosh, you're so on the ball. And I really have to give credit to her. Like it's a project that I feel like I'm piggybacking on, because she has just taken it and just done such incredible work to get it started. And I've reached out to some contributors, and obviously I'm helping with editing and things like that. And some of it is my work in the book, but she has just done remarkable work. So we're hoping to have that out probably March is what we're aiming for, to miss the quiet of January and February. So
okay, keep me posted. I'll get a copy for sure.
Next year should be a pretty eventful year if everything goes as planned. So yeah, I think that's also why I'm kind of in my shell now, and I'm like, I'm gonna get off Twitter for a while. I'm just gonna kind of do
well, I know you just moved and bought a house, and you're fixing that up, and lots going on there, right? So.
Yeah, calm before the storm as well too. Like once, if everything goes forward, that's going to be a tidal wave of hate. So I think I'm just kind of enjoying the calm before the storm, getting ready for the next, portion of the battle.
Right, right. Yeah.
Mhm.
Okay, well, I think we can wrap up there, Andrea, unless there was anything else that you wanted to burning in your heart to say.
No, I don't think so. And yeah, you always have such good questions, and we cover so much. And I'm a talker, so I say a lot
Oh,
more.
it's so easy to talk. Like I really enjoy our conversations. It's really a delight to talk, and you're so easy to talk to and open about things. So it's really wonderful. And I'm really hoping that people really take to heart what your experiences and what you're saying about this, and it'll help shift some thinking about the whole sex industry and paying for sex, and get people to really look at this with a different perspective. So
Mhm.
thanks so much again.
Well, and thanks for all the work that you do. I follow all your videos and listen to them now on my runs and stuff. And yeah, you just interview the most interesting people. And I think really
I didn't
men,
know you listened to any of the other interviews, so
yeah.
thank you.
Well,
Yeah,
and men leading men is the way, right? I think men, their guard comes down when it's other men that are being vulnerable with them and sharing. It's not
yeah,
like that us versus them of the gender wars, it's much
yeah,
more men to men. So I think more men need to be doing what you're doing and start these conversations and create these channels where this information's
yeah,
available. And it's so validating to women like me too. So,
yeah. Well,
thank you.
you are the most watched interview on my channel. So,
Oh.
and people I've had, I've had clients who paid for sex and they watched it and it was surreal. It was, really has been making an impact on them to hear a real, because see, in their mind, they're really, the women they pay for sex are objects. They're not really people. I know that sounds weird to people, but this is just how the brain's working in this situation where they're in an altered state, and a lot of them are really acting out in an addictive sort of mindset, right? And then to hear a real person like you, actually talk about it, it's been very enlightening for a lot of them, and so it's already making a difference, Andrea. So thanks again for that.
It's wonderful. Thanks. We'll have to do part 3.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll say bye for now, and you have a great rest of the week, and thanks so much again. Take
You as
care.
well. Thanks, Paul. Bye.